Good evening. Welcome to this, the second annual lecture in Digital Humanities and Public Culture, co-hosted by the Humanities Research Centre and the Centre for Digital Humanities Research. My name is Dr. Terry Nurmikofola, and I would like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we meet, and to turn off this update thing. Well, maybe not, maybe that'll be your problem. To celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we meet, and to pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging. Our speaker tonight, glorious, beautiful speaker tonight, is Dr. Stuart Dunn. Thanks for laughing, Lily. He's the head of the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and he's the author, amongst other things, of a monograph published by Routledge by the title of A History of Place in the Digital Age, which you can purchase for a 20% discount if you can pry this flyer off my court, or get another copy of the flyer from Stuart afterwards. You have options. I'm particularly delighted to be able to have this opportunity to hear from another one of our colleagues from King's, and to generally have had this opportunity to further sort of cement the connections between our institutions, particularly in this context of the digital humanities, because that's where my area of research and interest lies as well. Now, like me, and like many of us in the digital humanities, Stuart began his academic life as a Luddite, but he has since learned to turn his phone off. As a Luddite, but perhaps with, I would say, a hope and a dream of getting an actual proper job. He diversified and got an interdisciplinary PhD in, wait for it, the Aegean Bronze Age dating methods and paleovolcanology. There's loads of employment opportunities in that, right? You got it from Durham though, which is actually pretty prestigious, so we can applaud him for that instead. He's not going to talk about that tonight, I'm sorry to say, because who isn't fascinated? This is going so well. He's going to talk to you about topics which are more directly aligned with his interest in the history of cartography, digital approaches to landscape studies, and spatial humanities. I can't wait to hear about what he's going to tell about finding ourselves, particularly in the context of creating, exploring, and communicating personal cartographies with technology. So thank you, Stuart, and do a better job than I did.
To be honest, I don't think I can follow that. Thank you very much, Teddy, for that. And as I say, I just don't know how to follow that, really. I'll do my best, though. I would just like to extend my own very warm thanks for being here. And what a pleasure it is to be here this evening. I've been to Australia once before, but only for a conference, basically for about 4 days, I think. This is the first opportunity I've had to come and hang out and actually talk to people and learn about the amazing things going on here at ANU in Digital Humanities. So very many thanks to Harry and everyone else involved who's made that possible. So, yes, to the title of my talk this evening. By the way, I tend to roam about when I'm talking. I had a promotional video made of me promoting one of our BA programs before I came out. They actually had to draw a cross on the floor so I didn't keep wandering in and out of the camera. So I hope you don't find that too distracting. What I am talking about this evening is the idea of how we locate ourselves, how we find ourselves in the world. So I'd probably better begin by explaining two of the key concepts in my title. First of all, personal cartographies. By these, I don't mean simply maps that we draw to show where we are, although that could be part of what I mean by that. What I mean is the set of cognitive infrastructures that we use to locate ourselves in the world, the kind of cognitive extensions in the form of technology. Which brings me on to my second definition, which is that of technology. I am interpreting the word technology very, very broadly here. I am not just necessarily talking about the digital. In fact, it will be some way into the talk before I get to the digital. But what I hope to show is that there is a kind of trajectory that dates back long before we had digital means of locating ourselves, which informs how those cognitive infrastructures of personal cartography work. So, as anyone This was working just now. Well, you saw it was working just now. Okay, I'll just stand here for now and see if I can get this working as things go on. Oh, no, it's not working at all. Ah, here we go. So, as anybody who has asked for directions in New York City will attest, the idea of communicating place can be very, very complicated and can be quite difficult. In fact, one of the exercises which student rhetoricians were required to do in classical Athens were to stand with their arms down by their sides and literally describe a place, and it is extremely difficult to do that. The reason for this is there is a dichotomy in the way we communicate and understand place between the space which is mapped and the space which is experienced. And that is going to be, I think, one of the key themes going through my talk this evening, this distinction between the mapped place and the experienced place. To illustrate this, I like to start close to home, in my case. So this is Chesil Beach, which is a spit of land on the south coast of England near where I grew up in Dorset. And it's quite distinctive. It is this band of shingle which connects the coastline here down to the island of Portland, which is this spit of land here. And it's connected to the actual coastal mainland. By the way, this bit of water here is called the Fleet. This is where the bouncing bombs, which were used to attack Nazi infrastructure in World War II, were tested, and apparently it is still absolutely full of unexploded bombs. Now, this, however, is a 4-year-old's drawing of a visit to Chesil Beach. Not my 4-year-old's, I don't have one myself. Somebody else's, which I had temporary use of for a while. But if you just look at this diagram, you can actually see there is a cognitive process of spatial recollection going on. The approach to the beach is actually a line reminiscent of a road. There is some schematic pebbles to denote shingle, I guess there, and a firm line at the end, which is presumably where the walk stopped. So I think this kind of childlike interpretation of place actually gives us some hints as to the cognitive challenges of putting place down on paper. So this distinction between the mapped place and the experienced place is a phenomenon which has been with us throughout history, effectively, and it is a phenomenon which is inherently political and susceptible to politicization. So this is actually the image from my talk, of course, from the poster. And this is from an exhibition that was put on at King's some years ago by the Archives. And it is Charles Booth's poverty map of London. I don't know if anyone has come across this, it's quite well known. And essentially what Booth did is he divided London up into essentially cadastrally according to address, and then he coloured each address according to the the social status of the occupants of that address. And he graded them from yellow, which was upper middle class and wealthy, down to black, which is lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal. Okay. I note that King's College London here has scored a light blue, which is poor, 18 shillings to 21 shillings a week for a moderate family. I don't quite know whether I should be taking offence at that or not. But this is an example of the imposition of a very subjective form of characterizational mapping on a Cartesian street grid, effectively. This is a kind of collapsing of the mapped place and one person's perception and interpretation of the experienced place. So this is, I think, one of the good examples of that. So this is also a phenomenon which is subject to subversive politicization, as well as politicization which enforces what you might think of as a pre-existing social structure. So one of my favourite nihilistic Marxist movements of the 20th century has to be Paris Situationists, led by Guy Debord in the 1950s, who took a very Marxist approach to the authorities who were seeking to plan Paris in a logical and geographical sense. Earlier than this, the municipal authorities of Paris had brought out a new authoritative map of the city, the Plan de Paris, and I saw, Trina, you had a copy of this up in your office earlier. But what they did is, what the Situationists did, was they physically cut the map up and rearranged it according to not how the geography of the city worked, but how easy it was for essentially the poor to get from one location to another. So this was in itself a kind of subversive reimagining of the urban geography of the city itself. So the distinction between the mapped and the experienced has also been deployed in other contexts. And this is where I start to edge into the digital aspects of some of my talks. This is not, I have to say, my project. This is a project I greatly admire, which was done at the University of Virginia's Scholars Lab a few years ago, which is this fantastic laboratory space which experiments with the digital in various different ways. And it is looking at the catalogue of ships in Book 2 of Homer's Iliad. So, for those of you not familiar with Homer, which largely includes me, I'm certainly not a Homeric scholar, but a very famous book of the Iliad is the book 2, where the ships before Troy are described according to the countries they had come from, or not the countries, that's the wrong word, the city-states they had come from. Now this is very historically important because this gives us an insight into where was active in Greece in the Homeric Dark Ages, so I guess around the 8th to 6th century, well, no, not as late as the 6th, 8th and 7th century BC. And what the Scholars Lab did was they mapped the location of each of the places and compared it with the order in which they crop up in the text. And what they found is the geography, the sequential geography of the places in the text accorded to a very logical geography mapped onto the map, which of course didn't exist at the time. Now, the reason for this is that, of course, the Iliad would not have been written down. It would have been remembered and recited orally for audiences. So what Homer has done is he has placed in sequence the places in an order in which somebody familiar with the geography of Greece at this time through merchant connections or whatever would be able to remember. It is a cognitive assistance for somebody who has to remember this and read it out loud. So, this brings me to how the Greeks approached this problem, and this is where Ptolemy comes into it. So, Claudius Ptolemy was a 2nd century intellectual and geographer, and he wrote about a number of things, and in particular, he identified in his Biographia this distinction between geography and chorography. Okay? So, geography, he says, this is measured space. This is what I'm talking about map space. The graphic representation of the known world as a whole, of the things that relate to it as a whole. It differs from chorography, which is about describing what we can see and feel and experience. Okay, this was a very, very important distinction. So chorography is about describing every smallest detail, as it says there, creeks, hamlets, villages, etc., etc. Now, Ptolemy goes on to make a value judgment as to the relative merits of geography and chorography. He tells us that geography is the subject of the fairest and most sublime contemplation to reveal human perception by mathematics, the nature of the heavens themselves, etc., etc. I won't read the rest of it out. Now, the reason Ptolemy says this, the reason he believes this, is that geography is mathematically quantifiable. Therefore, it is able to aspire to the mathematically quantifiable Greek ideal. This is an idea that pervades classical culture at this time in the arts, sculpture, poetry, tragedy, comedy, and also philosophy. So geography is better, mappable space is better because it is possible to achieve an ideal in the way that the subjective, described human space isn't. So this informed a lot of Ptolemy's research. He looked at the way in which, for example, the angle of the sun affected shadows. And as a result, he is credited with inventing the gnomon, or the sundial, which is a method used essentially to calculate coordinates in this sense. So if you know exactly where the sun is going to be at midday in a particular location, you can then work out other locations from that, independently of any described experienced place. And on the basis of this, Ptolemy drew up what was effectively the first list of coordinates. Okay? They were not 100% accurate, as far as we can tell. He didn't actually produce any maps, but a map produced on Ptolemy's coordinate table would look something a little bit like this. So this is essentially the first map that we have that is based on data, that is based on independently quantifiable data. And this, I think, well, it was a very, very influential way of approaching the whole subject of geography and the description of place, for reasons that I shall now go on to. So I'm now going to jump forward a number of centuries and to again keep with the theme of how technology places itself between this distinction between geography and chorography. And I'm going to look at the antiquarian chorographers of the 16th, 17th and 18th century of Western Europe. The reason I am making this jump and the reason I am focusing on the antiquarian chorographers is because they were responding to this new technological innovation, that of movable print and that of copper engraving, which opened up vast new possibilities for how mass communication might function. So one of the first chorographers was John Leland, who was geographer royal to King Henry VIII. He died in a lunatic asylum in 1552. I think working for Henry VIII probably did that to you. But he was tasked, excuse me, I just need to grab a glass of water. He was tasked by the king of undertaking an inventory of the monasteries which Henry was industriously dissolving and taking all the property of. So in 1549 he undertakes this laborious journey and search. I think the proofreaders then spotted an opening, presumably. But he developed this methodology for describing each of the places he went to. And Lucy Tolman Smith, as it says there, notes in the introduction to a much later edition of the laborious journey that he based his approach around facts which he then sketched in from later. So there is a kind of, from memory later on. So there is a kind of a collapsing of the chorographic and geographic approaches going on there. But the way into the minds of the chorographers and how they made use of movable type in their approach to place and space can come from their prefaces. Now, all authors at this time wrote a preface to their work. Excuse me. And a couple of years ago, I spent some time going through a number of them to sort of see what we could find out. Now, prefaces are important for a number of reasons. Firstly, you can use them to suck up to the rich or important person who has commissioned your work and made it possible for you to do it. So William Stukeley in 1756, praising the president of the Society of Antiquaries here. They can be used to make additions to previous editions. So here we have another example from a later edition of Stukely's Itinerarium Curiosum, which is adding in some visual plates that were not in the previous edition. And you can use it to completely debunk those who have gone before, like Richard Warner here, pouring scorn on Geoffrey of Monmouth's interpretation of Roman Britain and how the pre-Roman Britain inhabitants had some kind of civilization, importance to British civilization. So there is a narrative here about, the wonderful classical Romans, which classically educated gentlemen like Richard Warner drew on in order to do that. But anyway, prefaces also give us an insight into the motivations of why this person has decided to write about space and place, and why they've decided to broadcast those opinions. Now, one of my favourite antiquarian chorographers is a man called Peter Heylin, 1599 to 1662, author of Cosmography and 4 books containing the chorography and history of the whole world. So, you aimed high in those days. Who was a very high church Anglo-Catholic priest at the time of Oliver Cromwell, which was not a very good time to be a high church Anglo-Catholic priest. So he spends quite a lot of time in his preface bewailing the infelicity of his times, how he has been deprived of his preferments and divested of his ministerial function, as the ordinary and public exercise thereof, etc., etc. Now this is a particularly pertinent anecdote which Heylin relays in his preface. So he has just been in court, having his preferments stripped away from him by Cromwell's prosecutors, and he tells us that he encountered in his passage from Westminster to Whitehall by a tall, big gentleman who, thrusting me rudely from the wall and looking over his shoulder on me in a scornful manner, said in a hoarse voice these words, "Geography is better than divinity," and so passed along. Whether his meaning that I were better a geographer than a divine, or that geography had been a study of more credit and advantage to me in the eyes of men than divinity was like to prove, I am not able to determine. Okay, so I am really quite beguiled by this image of ruffians stalking the streets of 18th century Whitehall, forcing decent, honest citizens to be geographers. But what we have is that Ptolemaic distinction between the measurable and the divine, the unmeasurable. So I think Heylin would certainly have been aware of Ptolemy's work, so I think he's very much plugging in to this distinction here. I know it's a bit blurred here, so I'll just read this out. So I think this is shored up, this view, when he goes on to say, as a geographer, I have been punctilious and exact into giving every province its peculiar bounds and laying out their several landmarks, tracing the course of most of the principal rivers, and so on and so on. So he really is appealing to this measurable idea of geography as some kind of intellectual perfection. He also relates this anecdote whereby a visitor to his home near Oxfordshire in Wychwood got lost effectively and appealed to Heylin to help him find his way out of the forests around Wychwood. And he then quoted this visitor saying, "That's strange," said he. "I have heard my old master, your father, say that you made a book of all the world and you cannot find your way out of the wood," which being spoken out of an honest simplicity, not out of any pretence to wit, or at least thought of putting a blunt jest upon me, occasioned a great deal of merriment for a long time after. Well, these were the days of the Puritans. There's probably not very much going on. But this idea of, the geographic description versus the geographic measurement versus chorographic description comes through in other, even better known antiquarian geographers. So one of the best known of all is William Camden, whose Britannia is probably one of the first great works of travel writing. But in Britannia, Camden starts to introduce another kind of element to this. He says, this Britons, the most ancient people of this isle, anciently inhabited the same from sea to sea, whose valour and prowess is renowned in both Latin and Greek monuments. So we have a kind of 16th century Nigel Farage moment here, whereby Camden is explicitly linking the merits of contemporary Britons to the might of the Latin and Greek past. And again, very much tied up with this idea of a space shared with that past. Okay, so this then brings me, and again reconnecting with the theme of technology, to the science and art and history of map making, which comes about at the same sort of time. So this is the period when the European powers are beginning to push their geographical horizons outwards to the New World. And of course, to do that, you need maps. So this produces a whole artisanal class of map makers. One of the best known of whom is Abraham Ortelius, the German map maker who operated in Flanders for many years. And in the preface to his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theatre of the world's orbit, published in English in 1501, he gives us this very, very important insight. So I'll just skip over the first bit, but he says at the end there, for the understanding of them aright, the knowledge of geography, which is in that respect is therefore to some, and not without just cause, called the eye of history. Now this is a really important moment for me. Ortelius is saying here that in order to understand the past, you have to have a map of it. This is a very revolutionary intellectual step to be taking at this time. He is saying that to understand the Roman world, it is not sufficient to read the works of Tacitus or Livy. To understand the Greek world, it is not sufficient to read the works of Herodotus or Thucydides. You cannot just get into the past by reading about it, you have to actually see it with the eye of history, so to say. So in the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Ortelius includes not only maps of the contemporary European world, but also maps of the Holy Land and of the Near East, annotated to assist biblical study of those regions. He also included what I believe to be the first map of the Roman Empire, the Romani Imperium Imago. And actually, it's not at all bad, given the resources with which it was produced. So this, I think, is really, really significant. This is a really significant intellectual shift. Now, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum was the first atlas. Okay? This was the first time that anyone had thought of putting together a set of maps in a book. And this brought about a few challenges. Okay? Yeah, it's not really something you could take on the train very easily. This is an issue which Ortelius addresses directly in his preface as well. Again, speaking to this distinction between geography and cartography, he says, especially maps of tables, etc., plots and so there are many a days extant everywhere to be sold, but they've neither not that, nor that they should buy them, etc. He is saying that either people cannot afford to buy maps, or if they have the money, they're too tight to buy them, therefore denying themselves this visual eye into the past. But then he also notes that the narrowness of the rooms and places, broad and large, maps cannot be so opened or spread. So it's literally saying people's houses are not big enough to accommodate maps of a size that would be useful. This drove his thinking in the invention of the atlas. It's an issue that Halen and Camden both address in their prefaces as well, both of them complaining about the cost of including images in their books. And anyone who has written a book will recognise publishers' concerns in these, I'm quite sure, being sort of leaned on to prune images out because of keeping the cover price to an acceptable sort of level. So this, I think, is a really kind of interesting this is a really sort of significant way in which the constraints of movable print and copper plating and all the other physical infrastructures of producing maps not only engendered possibilities for how people could describe the world and think about place and propose ideological views of place, but also we start seeing people coming up against the limitations of that medium as well. And another jump forward, and then came the internet. How has the internet impacted on this distinction between mapped space and experienced space? Well, I could also have put here, and then came the internet, and about 20 years later came the World Wide Web. Because my students know if they want to make me really grumpy, they forget that the two are not the same thing. But let's stick with the internet for now. So the internet, most people date to around 1969, when ARPANET in the United States comes online, and the idea of connecting networks together. It's all in the book if you want to check that out. But the internet was first and foremost a mechanism for collapsing place back in the day. So J.C.R. Licklider, who in various complicated ways contributed to much of the early thinking on internet working and how the early internet networks came about, published a landmark paper in 1960 called Man-Computer Symbiosis, where he sees the future of the coming information revolution being about essentially being able to sit in one place and be able to read a book thousands of miles away, or consult an archive thousands of miles away. So this sort of networked view of how knowledge was going to emerge was, I think this is quite emblematic of that. But a whole set of other events conspired at the same sort of time. There are many, which one could talk about, but I think one of the most significant, which has nothing to do with the internet, nothing to do with place, nothing to do with anything, except for what came later, was the launch of the Soviet Sputnik satellite on 4th of October 1957. Now this created a great moment of angst and fear in the United States. Not only was the Soviet Union edging ahead in the arms race, it showed that basically Russia had the rocket technology to deliver missiles potentially to the United States homeland. So a bunch of American scientists got very, very busy very, very quickly. So using the Doppler principle of sound waves extending or contracting compared to whether an object is moving away or approaching you, you know the score, think of a car approaching along a flat, straight road very fast, it makes a different noise coming as to where it's going. They were able to develop a methodology for tracking the Sputnik in real time. And that principle is the same principle which drives the GPS in our phones today. It didn't quite get to that point immediately. So throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, a small sub-industry of hardware for receiving GPS kind of emerged. If you were a particularly high-tech rambler, you might have had something like this on the right-hand side here. So this was one of the first real-time map displays. I think this was 1991, something like that. The Magellan handheld GPS receiver was actually the first one of its kind. So a whole kind of unintended consequence of the development of the ideas behind GPS, the ideas behind using Doppler to track movement, started to create this sort of sub-industry. At this time, however, the signal for GPS that was available to civilian receivers was a tightly regulated issue. Reason being that the satellites that were producing the GPS signals were exclusively owned by the United States military, and the United States military didn't want just anyone having access to it, as you can imagine. So the signal was scrambled to make it artificially inaccurate. So it wasn't really that much use unless you were, for example, in a ship going across the Atlantic and you just needed a very rough idea of the direction you were travelling in. Now, in what I think is another chapter of the story of disruption and unintended consequence that is the story of our technological engagement with place, a key moment came on 1st of September 1983 when a Korean airliner, civilian airliner, strayed into Soviet airspace and was shot down, with the loss of 260 or so people, which was another very key moment, because this made the US government realise that there was an overriding public interest in making the GPS signal, the accurate GPS signal, available for general public usage. So accordingly, some limited release of the signal was made for users such as commercial airliners. So again, I think this is an example of a technology that came about almost by accident, being sort of driven towards general civilian usage, again, as an unintended consequence of a really tragic situation. So again, jump forward 20 years or so, a little less than 20 years, and we have another set of historical contexts coming around in the year 2000. So the year 2000, the Cold War is pretty much over, the Berlin Wall has come down, there is a global easing of tensions. So against this backdrop, the US government takes the decision that it doesn't need a scrambled GPS signal at all. It's perfectly safe to share the accurate GPS signal with the world as a whole. So Bill Clinton, on 1st of May 2000, signs into law an executive order unscrambling the GPS signal. And this is the moment that it happened. You can actually see immediately where what's happened. So that essentially is how we come to have GPS. I see this as the latest link, as it were, in a chain of kind of disruption, of unexpected barriers, of unintended consequences, and of sort of necessity, really, of ways in which we engage with the world. So GPS is, of course, now with us everywhere. One of the key aspects of GPS traces and GPS data is that it's shareable. So when we go back to that distinction between the observable world and the mappable world, GPS collapses the two together, right? It's an absolutely key conceptual breakthrough. So this, for example, is the GPS traces page for on OpenStreetMap.com, the open geospatial mapping platform, sort of the Wikipedia equivalent of a world map. So it's a world map that anyone can contribute data to, including GPS data. So this is central West London. Okay, this is Piccadilly Circus, and up here we have Oxford Street going up to Oxford Circus, which is around about here somewhere. So these are simply traces that people have randomly chosen to share for whatever reason. I mean, why people share data is another lecture, and potentially rather more lucrative for things like advertising and that kind of thing. But a load of individuals, about hundreds certainly, possibly thousands of individuals, have made individual decisions to share their data. And this is the kind of dynamic / static picture of London that we get as a result. But this allows us to think about the original purpose of the layout of this part of London in a new light. So the West End of London, or that part of it, was laid out by John Nash, who stated his purpose quite clearly. He said that he wanted to use Regent Street as a barrier to separate the well-to-do folks in Mayfair to the west with the poor inhabitants of Soho to the east. And so he deliberately made the thoroughfares heading west much wider and more welcoming than the narrower thoroughfares heading east into Soho. So here we really can see the kind of outcome of this pejorative way of approaching urban planning. And we can see some of that coming through with GPS. Another sort of unintended consequence is that we begin to see how inaccurate, I guess, the tools of the past actually were. So before I grew up in Dorset, I actually lived for a few years in Greenwich in East London, which is the home to the Royal Observatory, which is actually the source of the prime meridian, 0 degrees longitude, which is a source of great touristic pride for the area of Greenwich. It actually goes right through the observatory. And actually the telescope of the observatory marks the point at which, when the sun passes through 0 degrees, the new day technically begins. But a few years ago, it emerged that tourists were taking selfies on the prime meridian, which is marked by this brass line in the ground here. They were looking at the photos on their phone and seeing that it didn't actually correspond to 0 degrees as determined by GPS, simply because the sextants or whatever that had been used to measure this weren't as accurate. So the astronomers of the Royal Observatory apparently had a stream of helpful people knocking on their door, telling them that their meridian was in the wrong place, and they should be concerned about this. But anyway, so this sort of gives us an insight into how this enhanced view of our place in the world brings us into tension with what's gone before. Bodies such as the UK Ordnance Survey have started to take an interest in this kind of thing. So, for example, they started to map by frequency the walks that were downloaded from the Ordnance Survey website. So, if you're planning a walk, you go to the Ordnance Survey website, download the route. So what they've done here is aggregated the number of times each walk was downloaded and represented that as a line thickness here. You can sort of see that fairly easily with relation to London. So obviously a lot of people downloading the riverbank walks there, and then there's a lot going on in the middle. I guess these would be routes downloaded for GPS journeys in cars and so forth. But this starts to get us to think a little bit more and a little bit more contemporaneously about that distinction between the mapped space and the lived space in a way. Now this is a slide that is very close to the heart of my students when I show it to them. So this is a representation of the student tuition fee riots in London in 2010, when the decision was made to bring in £9,000 a year tuition fees. So around about this time, or a little earlier, Google had launched its My Maps service, which allowed people to upload data tagged with GPS in real time. And so these enterprising students from UCL started using this platform to upload both where they were, but also to annotate the map with what was going on elsewhere, with what the police were doing. So where there were police horses or police dogs or wherever they are somewhere. And so they're starting to annotate the map with sort of descriptions of what was going on. So I think this is an early example of the explicit use of GPS to influence current events in real time. And I think if we look at moments like this enables us to, again, reflect on that measured versus experienced dichotomy. Another unintended consequence that I really like, so this came out, this was a story originally in Wired magazine in 2018, January 2018. So the Fitbit company make GPS data of people who use it freely available, or at least they did at the time. And one decidedly unintended consequence of this was that US military personnel going for runs around their base in Afghanistan actually created a very clear outline of the base, a map of the base. You know, you go for your run around the perimeter, basically. So this completely freely available map of a highly sensitive secret US base in Afghanistan was released to the world, causing some consternation, I believe, in the Pentagon. Not sure exactly what happened as a result of this, but again, this gives you an example of where the digital can lead us. So finally, we can use GPS to subvert even further this notion of what it means to record and experience place at the same time. I'm currently speaking to an amazing GPS artist in London called Jeremy Wood, who creates these sort of visionary, these artworks, which are basically based on him walking with a GPS receiver through the actual landscape and creating artworks, which essentially force us, I think, to question, how well that dichotomy between experience place and map place really works in a world that is mediated by GPS. This is one of his latest projects. So this is a one-to-one map of the University of Grenoble, created by himself and student volunteers. So these are bridges over the river here. So you go over the bridge, go a certain direction in either way. But what we have here is basically a complete sort of layout of the campus. But what he did is he asked the students not to use well-worn paths, but to use paths which weren't normally used, and to see what sort of image that created. So just to wrap up, my central argument here is that Ptolemy was quite right to make this distinction between chorography and geography. I'm not convinced he was right about the possibility of achieving some kind of ideal through measuring the world. Google would probably like us to believe that he was, but Google is Google. But since then, and probably before as well, there have been a series of technological innovations in the way we communicate and in the way that we are able to record space, which have contributed to and disrupted and been blown off course by a wide variety of events. And sort of the way that we respond to those technologies, the way we seize those opportunities, and the way we fall into pitfalls along the way, is, I think, really key to the way in which the technology and the digital is bound up to the way we find our way in the world, basically, and the way we find ourselves. So I'm going to finish with two shameless plugs. Terry has also already kindly, shamelessly, well, not so shamelessly, plugged the book. I actually have a bunch of flyers upstairs, which, as Terry mentioned, reduces the cover price from ridiculous to merely absurd. But I believe it is available through the ANU network anyway. I probably shouldn't say that, Routledge would like me saying that, but there you go. Secondly, forthcoming later this year, Routledge International Handbook of Research Methods of Digital Humanities, edited by myself and my amazing colleague at King's, Kristen Schuster. One of the better chapters is co-written by Tay, so I'm sure the ANU library will be buying at least 5 copies.
I'll buy 5.
Thank you so much for listening. That's it.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and not just for the, graduate school. Does anyone have any questions? Paul?
Yeah, I've got a question. You seem to be suggesting there that the GPS is a tipping point in some ways, but it's collapsing that distinction. And I'm wondering if you're not about 150 years too late by saying that. I'm thinking about the origin of the idea of a social survey, or the sort of the origins of social science, where 19th century people were beginning to think of the problems in the great cities of Britain, for example, and started walking around street by street, recording the conditions, speaking to people, recording people's experience of their place, and producing maps not just of lines, but maps of context. And so I'm wondering if not then we weren't starting to see this this division being collapsed?
Quite possibly. I think there are lots of tipping points in this story, and how far the tip goes depends on your point of view, really. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I guess social surveys of that kind would be very specifically targeted for particular reasons. So there is a kind of ubiquity to GPS that possibly there wasn't in that. So it's really a matter of scale, sort of scale and sort of framing of why you're doing it. Also, I would imagine, again, this isn't my field at all, but I would imagine that kind of survey would be much less open to appropriation by the companies that produce GPS, like Stavar. You're not going to get the kind of howler produced by the military base for that kind of thing. So there's an element of control there, or at least control at the individual level, which isn't there, possibly isn't there with GPS. But yes, it's certainly true. I mean, if you go back 100 years, it would certainly look like that kind of disruptive tipping point. I'm sure it would. Yeah. So.
Anyone else?
Hi, thanks for that. I'm wondering about cultural distinctions here, particularly in an Australian context, but more broadly, and the effect of systems like this in terms of colonising other sorts of knowledge systems and other cultural understandings of what place is and how it functions. And what do you think the role of the digital is in that kind of aspect? Yeah,
that is an absolutely fantastic question. So the whole premise of GIS is based on a geodetic world grid system called WGS84, which is a product of the United States Department of Defense. So the 360 degree, 180 this way, 180 that way, top and bottom, is an artificial construct of the West. It is completely impossible to map any kind of sort of non-Western culture meaningfully in that system. So yes, that is absolutely true. Also, there has been a lot of work done on how contributors to data sets based on that geodetic system represent the type of people doing the contributing. Overwhelmingly, the kind of people who participate in these systems are white, Western, male, you know, all you know, sort of Silicon Valley bro culture, basically. So yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think in terms of the scope of this technology, it does particularly speak to a Western context. We have to be very careful about projecting it outside the Western context.
Anyone else? Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about Pokemon, and I'm thinking about the relationship of space and augmented reality, and how that is like a data layer that relies on GPS, and thinking about that as kind of the next piece of this history, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, augmented reality combined with GPS is definitely making somewhat money. That's absolutely right. I actually stopped playing Pokemon when you started having to pay for the storage. But it also throws up a whole set of other kind of ethical and sort of social and cultural issues, particularly with sensitive sites, because there was a big debate last year, the year before, about Pokemon popping up at Auschwitz, basically. Obviously, a lot of people thought this was completely wrong and inappropriate, but one article I read pushed back against that and said, well, actually, the next generation should be engaging in science like this, with a way that makes sense to them. I'm not agreeing with that, but I'm just saying that that was one argument that was put forward. So I think there are going to be, well, to Paul's point, I think there are a whole set of issues that will emerge within the next 10 to 20 years, which you can't really foresee.
Any other questions?
Just what you were saying before about WGS84 and its influence on sort of cultural understanding of places outside the West. Do you have any sort of specific examples of that? Because as far as I was aware, it was mostly just a data set which described the shape of the Earth, because it's not actually spherical. And that most of the influence that the US military has definitely had on it is around not wanting to have too many details in deep ocean areas and places where they want to operate, basically.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, maybe I didn't put that quite right. I mean, it's not a narrative that's being specifically controlled by anybody, by the US or anyone else, but it is a particular way of representing the globe surface as a cylinder, rather than as a cone, for example, or as an azimuth, which are the other ways of doing it. So the point about the WGS-84, right, is that it's pegged to the Mercator projection system, which is conical. So that was invented. It was the same projection system that Ortelius used, and the one that we use in our phones. And it distorts the world in a particular way in order to make a sensible representation. It keeps the relative positions of different land masses. It has those relative positions correctly, which is what you need if you are flying an aircraft from Singapore to Australia. But it distorts the size of the land masses. So, as mentioned this to Katrina's students yesterday, we are trained culturally to believe that Australia is about a quarter of the size of Greenland, because that's how it looks on the Mercator system, where actually it's about 3 times the size of Greenland. So while there isn't an overtly political narrative there, it serves a particular purpose and makes us see the world in a particular way.
So it's the same. It's just basically the same argument about other projections in terms of it distorts in a particular way.
Yes, yes. So the Mercator projection squashes the middle of the Earth and stretches the northern and southern extremities. So it makes Britain look big in relation to its former colonial possessions in Africa, for example. You've seen the West Wing scene, right? You all know that? Yeah.
Any final questions?
YouTube it if you haven't seen it. Right.
Sorry. Any final questions before we get out of this sweltering hot and get wine outside? Anyone want to stand between me and wine? No, good, excellent. Will you all join me in thanking Stuart?
Thank you very much.